In the grand ballrooms of Regency England, where titles determined destiny and bloodlines dictated worth, a duke's choice between love and duty would echo through the corridors of history. What he believed was wisdom would prove to be the greatest folly of his life, and what he discarded as worthless would rise to become the most precious crown jewel of an entire kingdom. If you're listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you're listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled. The morning mist clung to the manicured gardens of Ashworth Manor like silk veils, as if nature herself sought to shroud the grandest estate in all of Derbyshire from prying eyes. Within the imposing Georgian walls, where portraits of stern ancestors gazed down from gilded frames, lived two souls whose fates would intertwine in ways neither could foresee. Lady Elara Whitmore moved through the servants' corridors with the quiet grace of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. At 19, she possessed an ethereal beauty that seemed almost otherworldly, cascading auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper, and eyes the color of spring violets that held depths of intelligence her station would never allow her to reveal. Born to a minor branch of the Whitmore family that had fallen from grace, she had been taken in as a lady's companion to the Duke's sister, Lady Margaret, a position that placed her in the peculiar limbo between servant and family. "Elara, do hurry!" Lady Margaret's voice rang through the morning air as she adjusted her riding habit. "Adrian will be here any moment, and I simply must look perfect for our ride through the estate." Adrian Blackwood, the Duke of Ashworth, was everything society deemed a perfect gentleman. At 28, his tall frame and aristocratic features had made him the most sought-after bachelor in England. His dark hair was always impeccably styled. His blue eyes held the confidence of a man who had never known want, and his smile could charm the most reluctant debutante. Yet beneath his polished exterior lay a heart that had begun to stir in ways that terrified him. As Elara fastened the pearl buttons on Lady Margaret's riding jacket, she caught sight of the Duke through the window. He sat astride his magnificent black stallion Tempest, his commanding presence making even the morning sun seem to bow in deference. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and in that instant, the world seemed to pause. It was a look that spoke of stolen conversations in moonlit gardens, of shared laughter over forbidden books, of a connection that transcended the rigid boundaries of their world. "Your Grace!" Elara curtsied deeply as the Duke entered the morning room, her heart racing despite her composed exterior. "Miss Whitmore," he replied, his voice carrying a warmth that made Lady Margaret glance between them with growing suspicion. For months, these stolen moments had been their secret rebellion against a society that would never accept their love. Adrian would find excuses to linger in rooms where Elara worked, engaging her in discussions about literature and philosophy that revealed her sharp intellect. She, in turn, had shown him a world beyond duty and expectation, where genuine emotion mattered more than bloodlines. But today felt different. There was a tension in Adrian's shoulders, a distance in his usually warm gaze that made Elara's stomach clench with foreboding. "Margaret," Adrian said, his voice unusually formal, "I'm afraid I must postpone our ride. Father wishes to see me in his study immediately." The Duke's father, the imposing Earl of Ashworth, was a man who viewed emotion as weakness and love as a luxury the nobility could ill afford. His study was a fortress of mahogany and leather, where the weight of centuries of tradition pressed down upon all who entered. "Adrian," the Earl began without preamble, his steely gaze fixed upon his son, "I have received a most advantageous proposal. Princess Isabella of Valdoria has expressed interest in a union between our houses. The political and financial benefits would be substantial." Princess Isabella was everything a future duchess should be: beautiful, wealthy, and possessed of a bloodline that could be traced back to Charlemagne himself. She was also cold, calculating, and utterly devoid of the warmth that had drawn Adrian to Elara, like a moth to flame. Father, This is not a request, Adrian. It is a duty. The announcement will be made at the Midsummer Ball next week. As Adrian walked back through the corridors of his ancestral home, each step felt like a nail in the coffin of his happiness. He found Ilara in the library, her slender fingers tracing the spine of a volume of Wordsworth, and his heart shattered at the sight of her innocent trust. "Ilara," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. She turned, and the joy that lit her features at seeing him made what he had to do infinitely more painful. "I must tell you something," he continued, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. "There is to be an announcement, an engagement." The color drained from Ilara's face as understanding dawned. "To Princess Isabella." He nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "It is my duty, my obligation to my family, to my title." "And what of your obligation to your heart?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Hearts are luxuries that men like me cannot afford," he replied, the words his father had drilled into him since childhood, falling from his lips like poison. Ilara straightened, her spine becoming steel even as her world crumbled around her. "I understand, Your Grace. Forgive me for presuming otherwise." As she moved to leave, Adrian caught her hand, the touch sending electricity through both of them. "Ilara, please." "No," she said firmly, pulling away. "You have made your choice. I pray it brings you the happiness you seek." But as the library door closed behind her, both knew that happiness had just walked out of Adrian's life forever. What neither could foresee was that this moment of heartbreak would set in motion events that would reshape not just their destinies, but the fate of kingdoms. For sometimes, the greatest love stories begin not with a kiss, but with a goodbye that echoes through eternity. The Midsummer Ball at Ashworth Manor was to be the social event of the season, a glittering spectacle that would cement alliances and announce the future of one of England's most powerful ducal houses. For 3 days, carriages had rolled up the sweeping drive, depositing the cream of society onto the marble steps of the grand estate. Silk gowns rustled through corridors that had been polished to mirror brightness, while gentlemen in pristine evening wear discussed politics and trade in voices that carried the weight of inherited authority. Ilara had spent the morning arranging white roses and baby's breath in the ballroom, her hands steady despite the turmoil in her heart. Each bloom she placed felt like a small betrayal, as if she were decorating for her own funeral. The irony was not lost on her that she, who had shared Adrian's most intimate thoughts and dreams, was now preparing the stage for his engagement to another. "The flowers are exquisite, Miss Whitmore," came a voice behind her, cultured and smooth as aged whiskey. Ilara turned to find herself face to face with Princess Isabella of Valdoria. The princess was undeniably beautiful, with platinum blonde hair arranged in an elaborate coiffure and sapphire eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. Her gown, a creation of midnight blue silk adorned with diamonds, probably cost more than most families saw in a lifetime. "Your Highness," Ilara curtsied, noting how the princess's gaze swept over her simple day dress with barely concealed disdain. "I understand you serve as companion to Lady Margaret," Isabella continued, her tone carrying the particular brand of condescension reserved for those she deemed beneath notice. "How quaint. I do hope you'll find suitable employment elsewhere after the Duke and I are wed. I prefer to surround myself with more appropriate company." The dismissal was clear, but Ilara merely inclined her head. "Of course, Your Highness. I wish you every happiness." Isabella's smile was sharp as a blade. "Oh, I'm quite certain I shall be very happy indeed. Adrian is such a malleable man, don't you think? So eager to please those who matter." As evening descended, the ballroom transformed into a fairy tale setting. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across walls draped in cloth of gold, while musicians tuned their instruments in the gallery above. The finest families in England gathered in their most magnificent attire, creating a sea of silk, satin, and glittering jewels that spoke of centuries of accumulated wealth and power. Ilara stood in the servants' alcove, partially hidden behind a marble column, watching the spectacle unfold. She wore her finest gown, a simple creation of pale green silk that had belonged to her mother, and had arranged her auburn hair in a modest chignon. Lady Margaret had insisted she attend, claiming she needed her companion nearby for support, though Ilara suspected her friend's motives were more complex. "You look beautiful tonight," a familiar voice murmured beside her. Ilara's breath caught as Adrian appeared at her elbow, resplendent in his formal evening wear. His dark hair gleamed in the candlelight, and his blue eyes held a desperate intensity that made her heart race despite everything. "Your Grace, you shouldn't be here," she whispered, acutely aware of the curious glances from nearby guests. "People will talk." "Let them," he said fiercely, his hand brushing against hers in the shadows. "Ilara, I need you to know—" "Adrian!" Princess Isabella's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. She glided toward them, her smile never wavering, even as her eyes promised retribution. "There you are, darling. I've been looking everywhere for you." She slipped her arm through his with practiced ease, her diamond bracelet catching the light as she did so. "And Miss Whitmore, how lovely to see you again. Though I must say that gown is quite vintage, isn't it?" The insult landed with surgical precision, drawing a few titters from nearby ladies who had overheard. Ilara felt heat rise in her cheeks but maintained her composure. "It was my mother's," she replied quietly, lifting her chin with dignity that made Adrian's chest tighten with pride and regret. "How sentimental," Isabella purred, her tone making the word sound like a disease. "Adrian, darling, your father is waiting to make the announcement. We mustn't keep our guests in suspense any longer." As they moved away, Adrian cast one last, agonized look over his shoulder at Ilara, who stood frozen in the shadows like a statue carved from heartbreak. The Earl of Ashworth took his position at the head of the ballroom, his commanding presence immediately silencing the assembled crowd. "My lords and ladies," he began, his voice carrying easily across the vast space, "it is my great honor to announce the engagement of my son Adrian, Duke of Ashworth, to Her Royal Highness Princess Isabella of Valdoria." The applause was thunderous, a wave of approval that seemed to shake the very foundations of the manor. Adrian stood beside Isabella, his smile perfectly crafted for public consumption, while she basked in the adulation like a flower turning toward the sun. "Furthermore," the Earl continued, raising his hand for silence, "I am pleased to announce that the wedding will take place in 6 weeks' time, here at Ashworth Manor, followed by an extended honeymoon tour of the continent. 6 weeks. The words hit Ilara like physical blows, each one driving home the finality of what was happening. She pressed herself further into the shadows, fighting the urge to flee as the crowd surged forward to offer congratulations to the happy couple. "Ilara?" Lady Margaret appeared at her side, concern etched across her features. "Are you quite well? You look terribly pale." "I'm fine," Ilara managed, though her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Perhaps I should retire. The excitement has been overwhelming." But as she turned to leave, disaster struck with the swift brutality of a summer storm. "Oh, Miss Whitmore!" Princess Isabella's voice rang out across the ballroom, carrying clearly over the conversations. "Before you go, I simply must share the most amusing story with our guests." The crowd turned as one, their attention focusing on Ilara like a spotlight. She felt trapped, pinned in place by hundreds of curious eyes, as Isabella glided toward her with predatory grace. "You see," Isabella continued, her voice pitched to carry to every corner of the room, "Miss Whitmore here has been harboring the most delightful delusion. She actually believed that my dear Adrian might have feelings for her. Can you imagine?" A collective gasp rippled through the assembly, followed by the kind of shocked silence that precedes a social execution. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face as every eye in the room fixed upon her with a mixture of pity, scandal, and barely concealed glee at witnessing such a spectacular fall from grace. "Isabella," Adrian's voice was sharp with warning, but the princess was far from finished. "Oh, but it gets better," she continued, her smile never wavering. "The poor dear actually thought that a Duke of England might lower himself to marry a penniless companion, as if breeding and bloodlines meant nothing at all." The laughter that followed was like acid, burning through what remained of Ilara's composure. She could see the faces around her, some shocked, some amused, others wearing the satisfied expressions of those who had always known she didn't belong in their world. "That's quite enough." Adrian stepped forward, his face dark with anger. But Isabella placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Darling, please. I'm simply clearing the air. After all, we can't have any misunderstandings about where loyalties lie, can we?" Her gaze fixed on Ilara with the intensity of a serpent preparing to strike. "Miss Whitmore, surely you can see how inappropriate your feelings have been, how they've made everyone terribly uncomfortable." Ilara stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, feeling as though she were drowning in a sea of hostile faces. The weight of their judgment pressed down upon her like a physical force, making it difficult to breathe. She could hear whispers starting to circulate, cruel, cutting observations about her presumption, her lack of proper breeding, her foolish romantic notions. She began, her voice barely audible above the growing murmur of conversation. "Speak up, dear," Isabella encouraged with false sweetness. "I'm sure everyone would love to hear your thoughts on the matter." It was then that Ilara found her strength. Drawing upon reserves of dignity she didn't know she possessed, she straightened her spine and lifted her chin. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying across the ballroom with quiet authority. "You are quite right, Your Highness," she said, meeting Isabella's gaze directly. "I have been foolish indeed. Foolish to believe that true worth could be measured by anything other than the kindness of one's heart and the nobility of one's actions. I see now that I was mistaken about many things." Her gaze swept across the assembled crowd, taking in their shocked faces and whispered conversations. "I wish you both every happiness you deserve." The emphasis on the final word was subtle but unmistakable, and several of the sharper minds in the crowd caught the implication. Isabella's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed venom. "How gracious," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "Though I do think it would be best if you found employment elsewhere, immediately. After all, we can't have any lingering complications, can we?" The dismissal was public, brutal, and final. Ilara felt the last threads of her old life snapping one by one as she stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the wreckage of her reputation and her dreams. "Of course," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "I shall make arrangements to leave first thing in the morning." As she turned to go, she caught sight of Adrian's face. The anguish there was so profound, so raw, that for a moment she almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then she remembered his silence during her humiliation, his failure to defend her when it mattered most, and her sympathy hardened into something colder and more resolute. She walked from the ballroom with her head held high, each step taking her further from the life she had known, and toward an uncertain future that suddenly seemed infinitely preferable to the gilded cage she was leaving behind. Behind her, the party continued, but the joy had gone out of it. Conversations were stilted, laughter forced, and more than one guest found themselves wondering if they had just witnessed something far more significant than a simple social embarrassment. What none of them could have imagined was that they had just seen the birth of a queen. The morning after the ball dawned grey and drizzling, as if the very heavens wept for what had transpired in the glittering ballroom of Ashworth Manor. Ilara packed her few belongings with methodical precision, each folded garment and carefully wrapped keepsake a small act of defiance against the chaos that threatened to overwhelm her. Her hands remained steady as she placed her mother's pearl earrings, her only inheritance of real value, into a small velvet pouch, though her heart felt as fragile as spun glass. Lady Margaret had wept genuine tears at their parting, pressing a purse of coins into Ilara's hands despite her protests. "You must write to me," she had insisted, her voice thick with emotion. "Promise me you'll let me know where you are, that you're safe." But it was the letter that arrived with the morning post that would change everything. The elegant script belonged to Lady Agatha Pemberton, the Earl's estranged sister, who had scandalized society 30 years prior by refusing an arranged marriage and instead pursuing a life of independence in London. She had heard whispers of the previous night's events through the intricate network of servants and sympathetic friends that connected even the most distant corners of English society. "My dear Miss Whitmore," the letter began, "I find myself in need of a companion possessed of intelligence, dignity, and the courage to stand against society's more ridiculous conventions. If you are willing to trade the suffocating air of Derbyshire for the invigorating chaos of London, I should be delighted to offer you sanctuary and employment. Your reputation for wit and learning precedes you, and I suspect we shall deal together admirably." 3 days later, Ilara found herself standing before an elegant townhouse in Bloomsbury, her modest trunk at her feet and her future stretching before her like an unwritten page. Lady Agatha proved to be a revelation, a woman of 60 with silver hair worn in a fashionable bob, keen grey eyes that missed nothing, and a wardrobe that defied every convention of what a spinster should wear. Her home was a sanctuary of books, art, and progressive thinking that attracted London's most interesting minds. "My dear girl," Lady Agatha said as she welcomed Ilara into her sitting room, which was painted a shocking shade of peacock blue and filled with exotic plants. "You look as though you've been through a war." "Excellent. Wars have a way of revealing one's true character, and I suspect yours is far more formidable than those fools in Derbyshire ever realized." Under Lady Agatha's tutelage, Ilara began to bloom like a flower finally given proper soil and sunlight. Her days were filled with correspondence, managing Lady Agatha's extensive social calendar and accompanying her to lectures, art exhibitions, and salons where ideas flowed as freely as wine. It was at one such gathering that she first encountered the world that would reshape her destiny. The Valdorian Cultural Society met monthly in the drawing room of Count Victor Aldrich, a distinguished gentleman who served as Valdoria's ambassador to the court of St. James. The small kingdom, nestled between Austria and Switzerland, was known for its progressive policies, thriving art scene, and remarkably enlightened approach to governance. What Ilara discovered, to her fascination, was that Valdoria was also facing a constitutional crisis that would soon capture the attention of all Europe. "The old king grows weaker by the day," Count Aldrich explained to the assembled group one foggy November evening, his accented English carrying the weight of genuine concern. "His only heir, Prince Maximilian, died in that tragic riding accident last spring, leaving the succession in question. The Constitution requires a monarch, but the bloodline has complications." Ilara, seated quietly in the corner with her notebook, Lady Agatha insisted she attend these gatherings to broaden her education, found herself drawn into the discussion despite her intention to remain invisible. "Forgive my ignorance, Count Aldrich," she ventured, her voice clear and thoughtful, "but surely there must be provisions for such circumstances. Most constitutional monarchies have established protocols for succession crises." The Count's eyebrows rose with interest. "Indeed, Miss Whitmore, you demonstrate a keen understanding of constitutional law. There are provisions, but they are unusual. The Valdorian Constitution, written during our revolution 60 years ago, contains a unique clause. If the direct line fails, the crown may pass to any individual of noble birth who can demonstrate both the wisdom to rule and the support of the people." "How remarkably progressive," Lady Agatha observed, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "I imagine that has caused quite a stir among Europe's more traditional monarchies." "Indeed it has," the Count replied with a wry smile. "But it has also attracted some fascinating candidates. We have received inquiries from minor royalty across the continent, each believing they might have a claim. The process involves a series of examinations, tests of knowledge, wisdom and character, followed by a public presentation to the Valdorian Parliament and people. As the weeks passed, Ilara found herself increasingly drawn into discussions about Valdorian politics and culture. Count Aldrich, impressed by her quick mind and genuine interest, began lending her books on Valdorian history and law. She devoured them with the hunger of someone who had been intellectually starved, her natural intelligence finally given proper nourishment. It was during one of these study sessions that she encountered Dr. Marcus Thorne, a brilliant scholar of international law who had been retained by the Valdorian government to oversee the succession process. Unlike his distant cousin Sterling, the pompous heir to a banking fortune who had once courted Lady Margaret, Marcus was a man of genuine substance. Tall and lean, with dark hair touched by premature silver at the temples, and warm brown eyes that reflected both intelligence and compassion, he possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from achievement rather than inheritance. "Miss Whitmore," he said as Lady Agatha introduced them at one of her famous Thursday salons, "Count Aldrich speaks very highly of your insights into constitutional law. I understand you've been studying the Valdorian succession question with considerable interest." "I find it fascinating," Ilara replied, surprised by her own boldness. "The idea that merit and wisdom might triumph over mere bloodline seems almost revolutionary." "Revolutionary, perhaps, but not without precedent," Marcus replied, his eyes lighting with the enthusiasm of a true scholar. "The ancient Romans had similar provisions, and several of the German states have experimented with elective monarchies. What makes Valdoria unique is the emphasis on popular support alongside parliamentary approval." Their conversation continued long into the evening, ranging from constitutional theory to philosophy, literature, and the changing nature of governance in the modern world. Ilara found herself matching his intellectual pace with ease, her years of hidden study finally finding an appreciative audience. "You have a remarkable mind, Miss Whitmore," Marcus said as the evening drew to a close. "Have you ever considered that your talents might be wasted in your current position?" The question haunted Ilara in the days that followed. Lady Agatha, with her characteristic perceptiveness, noticed her companion's growing restlessness. "My dear," she said one morning as they took their customary walk through Russell Square, "you have the look of a woman standing at a crossroads. What troubles you?" Ilara hesitated, then found herself pouring out her thoughts. Her growing fascination with Valdorian politics, her conversations with Dr. Thorne, and the strange sense that her life was building towards something she couldn't yet name. Lady Agatha listened with the patience of a woman who had learned to read between the lines of what people said and what they meant. When Ilara finished, her mentor was quiet for a long moment, watching the autumn leaves dance in the wind. "Tell me, my dear," Lady Agatha said finally, "what do you know of your mother's family, the Whitmores before their fall from grace?" "Very little," Ilara admitted. "Mother rarely spoke of it. I know they were once prominent, that there was some scandal that led to their exile from society, but the details were always vague." "Perhaps it's time you learned the truth," Lady Agatha said, her voice carrying a weight that made Ilara look at her sharply. "Your mother's grandmother was Lady Catherine Whitmore, who married Count Friedrich von Oldenburg in 1798. The marriage was brief. He died in the Napoleonic Wars, but it was legitimate and it was recorded in the Austrian Imperial Registry." Ilara stopped walking, her heart beginning to race. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, my dear girl, that you have noble blood, Austrian noble blood, which, according to the treaties signed after the Congress of Vienna, extends to certain rights and recognitions throughout the German states and their allied kingdoms." Lady Agatha's smile was both gentle and fierce. "Including Valdoria." The revelation hit Ilara like a physical blow. For months, she had been studying the Valdorian succession as an intellectual exercise, never imagining that she might have any personal connection to it. The irony was almost overwhelming. She, who had been dismissed as a penniless nobody, actually possessed the very bloodline that could make her eligible for a crown. "But surely," she stammered, "surely there must be dozens of candidates with stronger claims, better qualifications." "Perhaps," Lady Agatha agreed, "but how many of them have spent months studying Valdorian law and culture? How many have demonstrated the kind of intellectual rigor and moral courage that you showed in that ballroom? How many have the support of people like Count Aldrich and Dr. Thorne?" That evening, as Ilara sat in her small but comfortable room overlooking the square, she found herself staring at her reflection in the window glass. The face that looked back at her was no longer that of the frightened girl who had fled Ashworth Manor in disgrace. Months of intellectual stimulation, proper nutrition, and the confidence that came from being valued for her mind had transformed her. Her auburn hair gleamed with health, her violet eyes held depths of knowledge and determination, and her bearing spoke of a woman who had found her purpose. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie. Lady Agatha entered, carrying a leather portfolio that she placed on the small writing desk. "I took the liberty of writing to Count Aldrich," she said without preamble. "He would like to meet with you tomorrow to discuss your options. The portfolio contains copies of the relevant documents, your mother's birth certificate, the marriage records, the genealogical charts that establish your claim." Ilara's hands trembled slightly as she opened the portfolio, seeing her family's history laid out in official documents and careful script. It was all there, the noble lineage, the legitimate connections, the legal foundation for what had seemed impossible just hours before. "Lady Agatha," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what if I'm not worthy? What if I fail?" Her mentor's expression softened with genuine affection. "My dear girl, you have already proven your worth in ways that matter far more than bloodline or title. You have shown grace under pressure, dignity in the face of humiliation, and the courage to rebuild your life from nothing. Those are the qualities of a true leader." As Lady Agatha left her alone with her thoughts, Ilara found herself thinking not of crowns or kingdoms, but of a ballroom in Derbyshire where she had been publicly humiliated for daring to love above her station. The girl who had walked away from that scene in disgrace was gone, replaced by a woman who was beginning to understand that sometimes the greatest victories come not from avoiding the fall, but from how magnificently one rises afterward. Tomorrow, she would meet with Count Aldrich and learn whether her impossible dream might actually be within reach. Tonight, she would allow herself to imagine a future where worth was measured not by the circumstances of one's birth, but by the content of one's character and the strength of one's convictions. What she couldn't know was that far away in Derbyshire, a certain duke was discovering that his perfect marriage was proving to be anything but perfect, and that the woman he had discarded was about to become the most talked-about figure in all of Europe. The Valdorian embassy on Grosvenor Square had never hosted such an extraordinary gathering. Word had spread through London's diplomatic circles like wildfire. A young Englishwoman of previously unknown noble lineage was being seriously considered as a candidate for the Valdorian throne. The very notion had sent shockwaves through the established order, where crowns were inherited, not earned, and where the idea of merit-based monarchy seemed as radical as revolution itself. Ilara stood before the ornate mirror in Lady Agatha's dressing room, hardly recognizing the woman who gazed back at her. Gone was the simple companion's attire she had worn for so many months. In its place was a gown of deep sapphire silk that brought out the violet depths of her eyes, its elegant lines speaking of both sophistication and understated authority. Her auburn hair was arranged in an intricate style that managed to be both fashionable and regal, while her mother's pearl earrings, once her only valuable possession, now seemed like the perfect complement to her transformed appearance. "You look every inch a queen," Lady Agatha declared with satisfaction, adjusting the delicate diamond necklace she had insisted on lending for the occasion. "More importantly, you carry yourself like one. That, my dear, is something that cannot be taught or inherited. It must be earned." The past 3 months had been a whirlwind of preparation and examination. Count Aldrich had presented Ilara's case to the Valdorian Parliament with meticulous care, providing not only the genealogical evidence of her noble lineage, but also detailed accounts of her intellectual capabilities and moral character. Dr. Marcus Thorne had become her unofficial tutor, guiding her through the complexities of international law, economic theory, and diplomatic protocol, with a patience and encouragement that had gradually blossomed into something deeper than mere professional respect. The preliminary examinations were merely the beginning, Marcus had explained during one of their study sessions in the embassy's library. Tonight's presentation to the diplomatic corps is your true test. You must demonstrate not only your knowledge, but your ability to command respect from those who have spent their lives in the corridors of power. The irony was not lost on Ilara that she, who had once been dismissed as unworthy of a duke's attention, was now being evaluated for a crown. The transformation was not merely external. Months of intellectual challenge and genuine respect had awakened a confidence she had never known she possessed. She had discovered that her mind was not only sharp, but remarkably adaptable, capable of grasping complex political concepts and synthesizing them into practical solutions. As her carriage drew up to the embassy, Ilara could see the glittering array of vehicles already assembled, the equipages of ambassadors, ministers, and members of parliament who had come to witness this unprecedented event. The very cream of London society had gathered to evaluate the woman who dared to seek a throne through merit rather than birthright. "Miss Whitmore," Count Aldrich greeted her at the embassy's entrance, his formal bow carrying genuine warmth. "You look magnificent. Are you prepared for what awaits you?" "As prepared as one can be for the impossible," Ilara replied with a smile that held both nervousness and determination. The embassy's grand ballroom had been transformed into something resembling a court of examination. Representatives from a dozen European nations sat in elegant chairs arranged in a semicircle, their faces displaying varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and barely concealed hostility. At the center of the arrangement sat the Valdorian delegation, led by Prime Minister Heinrich Brennan, a distinguished gentleman whose reputation for fairness was matched only by his shrewd political acumen. "Ladies and gentlemen," Count Aldrich announced as Ilara entered the room, "I present Miss Ilara Whitmore, candidate for the throne of Valdoria." The murmur that rippled through the assembly was like the rustle of silk and steel. Ilara could feel dozens of eyes evaluating her every move as she walked to the center of the room with measured grace, her bearing neither arrogant nor subservient, but carrying the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she stood. "Miss Whitmore," Prime Minister Brennan began, his accented English carrying the weight of formal protocol, "you stand before representatives of the great powers of Europe, seeking recognition for a claim that challenges centuries of tradition. Tell us, what gives you the right to aspire to a crown?" It was the question she had been preparing for, yet hearing it spoken aloud in this magnificent room, filled with skeptical faces, made her heart race. She took a breath, drawing upon every lesson Lady Agatha had taught her about dignity under pressure. "Your Excellency," she replied, her voice clear and steady, "I do not claim the right to a crown by virtue of my birth alone, though my lineage is legitimate and documented. I claim it by virtue of my preparation, my understanding of Valdoria's needs, and my commitment to serve its people with wisdom and dedication." "Pretty words," interjected the Austrian ambassador, his tone carrying barely concealed disdain. "But what practical experience do you have in governance? What qualifies you to rule a nation when you have never even managed an estate?" The challenge was direct and cutting, designed to expose her as an ambitious pretender. But Ilara had anticipated such attacks and had prepared accordingly. "Your Excellency raises an important point," she acknowledged with a slight nod. "Traditional preparation for monarchy has indeed involved managing estates and commanding armies, but Valdoria faces challenges that require different skills: economic modernization, constitutional reform, and the delicate balance between tradition and progress. I have spent months studying these specific challenges, working with experts in international law and economic theory to develop practical solutions." She gestured to Dr. Thorne, who stepped forward with a leather portfolio. "If I may, I would like to present my analysis of Valdoria's current economic situation and my proposals for addressing the trade imbalances that have plagued the kingdom for the past decade." What followed was a presentation that stunned the assembled diplomats with its depth and sophistication. Ilara outlined a comprehensive plan for economic reform that demonstrated not only her grasp of complex financial concepts, but her ability to synthesize information from multiple sources into coherent policy. She spoke of trade agreements, infrastructure development, and educational reform with the confidence of someone who had not merely memorized facts, but truly understood their implications. "Fascinating," murmured the French ambassador, leaning forward with genuine interest. "Your proposal for establishing a national university is particularly intriguing. How would you fund such an ambitious undertaking?" "Through a combination of private investment and gradual tax reform," Ilara replied without hesitation. "I propose creating incentives for wealthy merchants and nobles to invest in education, while simultaneously implementing a progressive taxation system that ensures the burden falls fairly across all levels of society." The questions came rapidly after that, each designed to test different aspects of her knowledge and judgment. She fielded inquiries about military strategy, diplomatic protocol, religious tolerance, and judicial reform, with a composure that gradually shifted the room's atmosphere from skepticism to grudging respect. It was then that the evening took an unexpected turn. "Miss Whitmore!" came a familiar voice from the back of the room, causing Ilara's blood to freeze in her veins. "How fascinating to see you again." The crowd parted to reveal Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Ashworth, resplendent in his formal evening wear and wearing an expression of barely controlled emotion. Beside him stood Princess Isabella, her beauty as striking as ever, but her smile carrying a venom that could have poisoned a regiment. "Your Grace," Ilara replied with perfect composure, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "What an unexpected pleasure." "Indeed," Adrian said, his voice carrying undertones that only she could interpret. "I had heard rumors of your elevation in circumstances, but I confess I found them difficult to believe." The tension in the room was palpable, as every diplomat present recognized the undercurrents of personal drama playing out before them. Princess Isabella stepped forward, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "How remarkable," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "The little companion, who once harbored such inappropriate feelings for my husband, now seeks to make herself a queen. One might almost call it poetic justice." The insult was calculated and cruel, designed to remind everyone present of Ilara's previous humiliation and suggest that her current position was merely the delusion of a woman scorned. Several of the assembled diplomats shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward with the anticipation of witnessing a spectacular social collision. But Ilara had learned much in the months since that terrible night at Ashworth Manor. She had discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed, and she had been trained by one of society's most formidable women in the art of verbal warfare. "Your Highness," she replied with a smile that was both gracious and deadly, "how kind of you to attend this evening's proceedings. I'm sure your presence here demonstrates your deep interest in constitutional monarchy and the peaceful transfer of power through merit rather than mere inheritance." The subtle emphasis on mere inheritance was not lost on anyone present, least of all Isabella, whose own claim to her title rested entirely on the accident of her birth. The princess's smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself with renewed viciousness. "Oh, but surely you cannot be serious about this charade," Isabella continued, her voice rising slightly. "The idea that someone of your background could actually rule a kingdom is quite absurd. What next? Shall we crown every ambitious servant girl who can recite a few facts about economics?" The attack was vicious and personal, designed to reduce Ilara to the humiliated companion she had once been. But the woman who stood in the embassy ballroom was no longer that frightened girl. She was someone who had been tested by fire and emerged stronger, someone who had discovered her own worth and refused to let others diminish it. "Your Highness raises an interesting point about background," Ilara replied, her voice carrying a steel that made several diplomats sit up straighter. "Indeed, my background includes months of intensive study under some of Europe's finest legal and economic minds. It includes practical experience in managing complex social situations and navigating the intricacies of diplomatic protocol. Most importantly, it includes the humility to recognize that true leadership comes not from the circumstances of one's birth, but from one's willingness to serve others with wisdom and compassion." She paused, allowing her words to sink in before delivering her final thrust. "I would suggest that such a background might actually be preferable to one that has never known anything but privilege, and has therefore never learned the value of genuine effort or the importance of earning one's position through merit." The silence that followed was deafening. Isabella's face had gone white with fury, while Adrian looked as though he had been struck by lightning. The assembled diplomats exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their assessment of the exchange. It was Dr. Thorne who broke the tension, stepping forward with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to managing difficult situations. "Perhaps," he said diplomatically, "we might return to the matter at hand. Miss Whitmore, I believe the Prime Minister had additional questions about your proposed judicial reforms." The remainder of the evening proceeded with a professionalism that spoke well of the diplomatic corps' ability to maintain decorum even in the face of personal drama. Ilara continued to field questions with the same composure and intelligence she had displayed throughout, while Adrian and Isabella remained silent observers, their presence a constant reminder of the journey that had brought her to this moment. As the formal proceedings concluded, Prime Minister Brennan rose to address the assembly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "the Valdorian Parliament will convene in 1 month's time to consider Miss Whitmore's candidacy. Based on this evening's demonstration, I can say with confidence that she has proven herself worthy of serious consideration." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained, a recognition of both her performance and her grace under pressure. As the diplomats began to file out, offering their congratulations and expressing their interest in following the proceedings, Ilara found herself face to face with Adrian for the first time in nearly a year. "Ilara," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to speak with you privately." She looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the confident duke who had broken her heart, but a man who appeared to be carrying the weight of profound regret. "I'm afraid that would not be appropriate, Your Grace," she replied with gentle firmness. "We are no longer the people we once were, and some conversations belong to the past." "Please," he said, his composure cracking slightly. "Just 5 minutes. There are things I need to say, things you need to know." Adrian, the single word, spoken with quiet authority, stopped him mid-sentence. "I wish you well, truly I do, but my future lies elsewhere now, and I think it's best for both of us if we leave the past where it belongs." As she walked away, escorted by Dr. Thorne toward the embassy's private quarters, she could feel Adrian's eyes following her. But for the first time since that terrible night at Ashworth Manor, she felt no pain at leaving him behind. She had found something far more valuable than his love. She had found herself. What she didn't see was the look of profound realization that crossed Adrian's face as he watched her go, or the way Princess Isabella's expression had shifted from triumph to something approaching fear. The woman they had dismissed as a nobody had just proven herself capable of commanding the respect of Europe's most powerful diplomats, and both of them were beginning to understand that they had made a mistake of historic proportions. In 1 month's time, the Valdorian Parliament would vote, and Ilara Whitmore might very well become Queen Ilara I. The girl who had once been deemed unworthy of a duke's love was about to discover if she was worthy of a nation's crown. The news of Ilara's triumph at the embassy spread through London society like wildfire, carried on the wings of gossip and speculation that transformed drawing rooms into battlegrounds of opinion. Within days, every newspaper in England was running stories about the Cinderella candidate, the mysterious young woman who had emerged from obscurity to claim a throne through merit rather than birthright. The very notion had set the established order trembling, as nobles across Europe began to wonder if the age of inherited privilege might be drawing to a close. At Ashworth Manor, the atmosphere had grown increasingly strained. Princess Isabella paced the morning room like a caged leopard, her usual composure shattered by the realization that the woman she had so publicly humiliated was now being hailed as a potential queen. The irony was bitter as poison. She, who had married a duke for his title and connections, was watching a former servant girl ascend to heights she could never reach. "This is intolerable," Isabella declared, her voice sharp with frustration as she confronted Adrian over breakfast. "That creature is making a mockery of everything we represent. Something must be done." Adrian sat in silence, mechanically cutting his eggs, while his mind churned with thoughts he dared not voice. The newspapers spread before him told a story that filled him with a complex mixture of pride, regret, and something dangerously close to longing. The woman described in these articles, brilliant, composed, commanding the respect of Europe's finest minds, bore little resemblance to the quiet companion he had known, yet he recognized in every word the intelligence and strength he had been too blind to appreciate. "Adrian!" Isabella's voice cut through his reverie like a whip crack. "Are you listening to me? I said something must be done about this situation." "What would you have me do?" he replied wearily, finally looking up from his untouched breakfast. "Challenge the Valdorian Parliament? Dispute the legitimacy of their constitution? Ilara has done nothing wrong, quite the opposite, in fact." The use of her Christian name sent Isabella into a fresh fury. "Ilara, you speak of her as though she were still, as though you still—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between them like a sword. "As though I still what, Isabella?" Adrian's voice carried a dangerous edge that made his wife step back. "As though I still recognize her worth? As though I still regret the choice I made? Because if that's what you're suggesting, then yes, I do." The admission hung between them like a confession of treason. Isabella's face went white, then red, as the full implications of his words sank in. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "How dare you sit there and tell me you regret our marriage while that nobody makes a spectacle of herself across Europe?" "She's not a nobody," Adrian said quietly, rising from his chair with the slow deliberation of a man who had finally reached the end of his patience. "She never was. I was simply too much of a coward to see it." Meanwhile, in London, Ilara was discovering that her newfound prominence came with both opportunities and challenges she had never anticipated. Lady Agatha's townhouse had become an unofficial embassy, with visitors arriving at all hours seeking audiences, offering advice, or simply hoping to bask in the reflected glory of association with a potential queen. "My dear," Lady Agatha observed one morning as they reviewed the day's correspondence over breakfast, "you've received invitations to 17 different social events this week alone. Half the hostesses in London are desperate to claim you as their discovery." Ilara smiled ruefully as she set aside yet another gilt-edged invitation. How quickly the world changes. 6 months ago, these same women wouldn't have acknowledged my existence. And that, my dear girl, is precisely why you're perfect for this role, Lady Agatha replied with satisfaction. You understand both sides of society's coin, the privilege and the powerlessness. That perspective will serve you well if you become queen. The word "if" still sent a thrill of nervous excitement through Ilara's chest. The Valdorian Parliament's vote was now only 2 weeks away, and despite the encouraging reports from Count Aldrich, she knew that nothing was certain. The very audacity of her candidacy had created powerful enemies among Europe's traditional monarchies, who saw her potential success as a threat to the established order. It was during one of her regular strategy sessions with Dr. Thorne that the conversation took an unexpected personal turn. They had been discussing the finer points of Valdorian trade law when he suddenly set down his papers and looked at her with an intensity that made her heart skip. "Ilara," he said, using her Christian name for the first time, "there's something I need to say before the Parliament votes, something that can't wait any longer." She felt a flutter of anticipation mixed with apprehension. Over the months of their collaboration, she had become increasingly aware of the way his eyes lingered on her face when he thought she wasn't looking, the way his hand would brush hers when they reached for the same document, the way his voice softened when he spoke her name. "Marcus," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Please, let me finish. I know this is neither the time nor the place, and I know that your future may take you far from England, but I cannot let this moment pass without telling you how I feel." He took a deep breath, his scholarly composure giving way to something more vulnerable and human. "I love you, Ilara. I love your brilliant mind, your courageous heart, and the grace with which you faced every challenge. If you'll have me, I want to stand beside you whatever the future brings, whether as a queen's consort or simply as the husband of the most remarkable woman I've ever known." The proposal was everything Adrian's had not been: freely given, based on genuine admiration and respect, offered without conditions or reservations. Ilara felt tears prick her eyes as she looked at this good, honorable man who saw her not as a prize to be won or a duty to be fulfilled, but as a partner worthy of love and respect. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, "are you certain? If I become queen, your life will never be your own. You'll be scrutinized, criticized, expected to subordinate your own ambitions to the needs of a kingdom you've never even seen." "I've thought of little else for weeks," he replied, reaching across the table to take her hands in his. "I know the challenges we would face, the sacrifices required, but I also know that I would rather face them with you than live a comfortable life without you." Before she could respond, the library door burst open to admit Lady Agatha, her face flushed with excitement and her eyes bright with news. "My dears," she announced breathlessly, "you must come at once. Count Aldrich has just arrived with the most extraordinary news from Valdoria." They found the Count in the drawing room, still in his travelling clothes and bearing the dust of hard riding. His face was grave, but his eyes held a light that spoke of momentous developments. "Miss Whitmore," he said, rising to bow formally as she entered, "I bring word from the Parliament. The preliminary vote has been taken, and you have been approved as the sole candidate for the throne." The words hit Ilara like a physical blow. She had known this moment might come, had prepared for it intellectually, but the reality was overwhelming. She was going to be Queen of Valdoria, not through inheritance or marriage, but through her own merit and the democratic choice of a nation's representatives. "There's more," Count Aldrich continued, his voice carrying a note of urgency. "The formal coronation has been scheduled for 1 month hence, but there are complications. Several European powers have expressed their displeasure with the Parliament's choice, and there are rumours of potential interference. It would be wise for you to travel to Valdoria as soon as possible to begin the transition." The implications were clear. Her enemies would not accept her elevation quietly, and the sooner she could establish herself in Valdoria, the better her chances of surviving the political storms to come. "I understand," Ilara replied, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "When do we leave?" "We?" Dr. Thorne stepped forward, his expression determined. "Ilara, you haven't answered my question." She looked at him, this brilliant, honorable man who was offering to share not just her life, but her destiny, and felt her heart make the choice her mind had been wrestling with. "Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying across the room with quiet certainty. "Yes, Marcus, I will marry you. If you're brave enough to become a king consort, then I'm brave enough to become your wife." The joy that lit his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and swept her into his arms, spinning her around as Lady Agatha applauded and Count Aldrich beamed with satisfaction. "Well," Lady Agatha declared with characteristic pragmatism, "I suppose we'll need to plan a royal wedding along with a coronation. How delightfully complicated." The next 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of preparation and farewell. Ilara's transformation from companion to queen-elect required not just new wardrobes and protocol lessons, but a fundamental shift in how she saw herself and her place in the world. The girl who had once been dismissed as unworthy of a duke's attention was now preparing to rule a kingdom, and the magnitude of that change sometimes left her breathless. It was on her final evening in London that the past came calling one last time. She was in Lady Agatha's garden, stealing a moment of quiet reflection before the chaos of departure, when she heard footsteps on the gravel path behind her. "I thought I might find you here." She turned to find Adrian standing in the shadows of the rose arbor, his face haggard and his usual composure completely shattered. He looked like a man who had been wrestling with demons and losing. "Adrian," she said quietly, neither welcoming nor dismissing him, "you shouldn't be here." "I know," he replied, stepping into the moonlight. "I know I have no right to be here, no right to speak to you, no right to ask anything of you. But I couldn't let you leave without trying to explain." "There's nothing to explain," Ilara said gently. "You made your choice, as I have made mine. We are both where we belong." "Are we?" The question was torn from him like a confession. "Because I wake every morning knowing I made the greatest mistake of my life. I chose duty over love, title over truth, and I've paid for it every day since." "And what would you have me do with that knowledge?" Ilara asked, her voice carrying a sadness that spoke of old wounds finally healed. "Would you have me abandon my kingdom, my people, my future husband, to ease your regret?" "No," he said immediately, his voice breaking. "No, you deserve everything you've achieved and more. I needed you to know that I understand now what I lost. I needed you to know that you were never unworthy." "I was." They stood in silence for a moment. Two people who had loved each other in a different lifetime, now separated by choices that could never be undone. "I forgive you, Adrian," Ilara said finally, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had learned to command not just others, but herself. "I forgive you, and I hope you can forgive yourself. But this is goodbye, truly and finally goodbye." As she walked back toward the house, leaving him alone in the garden with his regrets, Ilara felt the last chains of her past fall away. Tomorrow, she would begin the journey to her new life, her new love, and her new crown. The girl who had been broken in a ballroom had become a woman who would reshape a kingdom, and that transformation was finally complete. Behind her, Adrian stood alone among the roses, watching the light of his lost love disappear into the house where she was preparing to become a queen. He had come seeking absolution and found instead the final confirmation of his loss. The woman he had discarded as unworthy was about to be crowned, while he remained trapped in a marriage as cold and empty as his own heart. The irony was perfect, complete, and utterly devastating. In trying to secure his future, he had destroyed it. In choosing the safe path, he had lost everything that mattered, and now, as carriages prepared to carry his lost love toward a crown, he was left with nothing but the bitter knowledge of what might have been. Tomorrow, Queen Ilara thy would begin her reign, and the world would never be the same. The cathedral bells of Valdoria's capital city rang out across the Alpine valleys with a clarity that seemed to pierce the very heavens, their bronze voices carrying news that would reshape the political landscape of Europe. Queen Ilara I had been crowned 6 months ago in a ceremony that combined ancient tradition with revolutionary innovation, and in that brief time she had already begun to transform not just her adopted kingdom, but the very concept of monarchy itself. Standing at the tall windows of the royal palace, Ilara, now Her Majesty Queen Ilara the Fran of Valdoria, gazed out over the bustling city that had become her home and her responsibility. The morning light caught the auburn highlights in her hair, which was now arranged in the elegant style befitting a queen, held in place by a simple circlet of gold and sapphires that had become her signature. Gone forever was the uncertain companion who had once arranged flowers for another woman's triumph. In her place stood a monarch whose intelligence, compassion, and strength had already earned the devoted loyalty of her subjects. "Your Majesty," came a familiar voice from behind her, warm with both formality and deep affection. "The morning reports from the ministers." She turned to smile at her husband, King Consort Marcus, who approached with the leather portfolio that had become part of their daily ritual. In the 6 months since their wedding, a ceremony that had been both intimate and magnificent, attended by representatives from across Europe, he had proven himself to be everything she had hoped: a wise counselor, a devoted partner, and a man whose love for her had only deepened as he watched her grow into her role. "What news from the trade negotiations with Austria?" she asked, accepting the portfolio while allowing her fingers to brush his in a gesture that still sent warmth through both of them. "Better than we dared hope," Marcus replied, his eyes lighting with the satisfaction of a scholar whose theories had proven correct in practice. "Your proposal for the Alpine Trade Consortium has been accepted in principle. The Austrian Emperor himself has expressed interest in establishing permanent diplomatic relations. It was a triumph that would have seemed impossible just a year ago. Valdoria, once a minor kingdom struggling with economic stagnation and political irrelevance, was now being courted by the great powers of Europe. Ilara's innovative approach to governance, combining democratic principles with monarchical efficiency, had created a model that other nations were eager to study and, in some cases, emulate. "And the university project?" she inquired, moving to her desk where architectural plans were spread across the polished surface. "Construction begins next month," Marcus reported with evident pride. "We've received applications from scholars across the continent who wish to join the faculty. The Royal University of Valdoria is already being hailed as a center of progressive learning. The university had been one of Ilara's first major initiatives as queen, an institution dedicated to merit-based education that would welcome students regardless of their birth or wealth. It was a radical concept that had initially faced resistance from traditional nobles, but the Queen's combination of diplomatic skill and unwavering determination had gradually won over even her harshest critics. A soft knock at the door interrupted their morning briefing. "Enter," Ilara called, and her private secretary, an efficient young woman named Catherine, appeared with a silver tray bearing the international correspondence. "Your Majesty," Catherine said with a curtsy, "the morning dispatches from abroad. There are several items that may require your immediate attention." Ilara accepted the letters with the practiced ease of a monarch who had learned to manage the constant flow of diplomatic communication. Most were routine: congratulations on recent policy successes, invitations to state functions, requests for trade agreements. But one letter bearing the seal of the British Embassy made her pause. "Marcus," she said quietly, her voice carrying a note that made him look up from his own correspondence. "This is unexpected." The letter was from Lady Margaret Blackwood, her former friend and companion from what now seemed like another lifetime. The elegant script was familiar, but the tone was formal, almost hesitant, as if the writer was unsure of her reception. "Your Majesty," the letter began, "I hope this correspondence finds you in good health and happiness. I write not as a representative of any official capacity, but as someone who once called you friend, and who has followed your remarkable ascension with admiration, and, I confess, a degree of wonder at how perfectly you have grown into your role. I feel compelled to share news that may be of interest to you, though I do so with some trepidation. My brother Adrian's marriage to Princess Isabella has deteriorated significantly. The princess has proven to be everything you once suggested she might be: cold, calculating, and utterly without the warmth or wisdom necessary for true partnership. Adrian has become a shadow of his former self, consumed by regret and the growing realization of what he discarded in his pursuit of duty. More significantly, there are rumors circulating in London society that Princess Isabella has been conducting an affair with Count Sterling Thorne. Yes, the same pompous heir who once pursued my hand. The irony is not lost on those of us who remember your warnings about both their characters. I write not to cause you pain or to reopen old wounds, but because I believe you should know that your triumph has been complete in ways you may not realize. You have become everything we always knew you could be, while those who dismissed you have discovered the emptiness of their choices. I remain, with deepest respect and affection, your devoted friend, Margaret." Ilara read the letter twice before setting it aside, her expression thoughtful but untroubled. Marcus, who had been watching her face carefully, reached across to take her hand. "Difficult news?" he asked gently. "Not difficult," she replied after a moment's consideration. "Simply final, the last chapter of a story that ended long ago." She felt no satisfaction in learning of Adrian's unhappiness, no vindictive pleasure in Isabella's betrayal. Those emotions belonged to the girl she had once been, not the woman she had become. The queen who now ruled Valdoria with wisdom and compassion had learned that true victory lay not in the defeat of one's enemies, but in the creation of something better than what had come before. "Your Majesty," Catherine interrupted softly, "the delegation from the Swiss Confederation has arrived for the afternoon audience." "Of course," Ilara replied, rising from her desk with the fluid grace that had become second nature. "Marcus, shall we greet our guests?" As they made their way through the palace corridors, Ilara reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. The walls around them were hung with portraits of Valdoria's previous monarchs, men and women who had inherited their crowns through bloodline and tradition. Soon, her own portrait would join theirs, but it would tell a different story. That of a woman who had earned her throne through merit, wisdom, and the courage to rise above the circumstances of her birth. The throne room of Valdoria's palace was a masterpiece of understated elegance, its soaring ceilings and tall windows creating an atmosphere of both grandeur and accessibility. Unlike the intimidating formality of many European courts, Ilara had insisted on an environment where visitors felt welcomed rather than diminished. The throne itself, a chair of carved oak inlaid with gold and precious stones, was magnificent, but not overwhelming, a symbol of authority tempered by approachability. The Swiss delegation, led by Ambassador Heinrich Müller, bowed formally as the royal couple entered. Ilara had learned to read the subtle signs of diplomatic body language, and she could see in their posture a respect that went beyond mere protocol. These men had come not as supplicants seeking favor, but as equals recognizing a fellow sovereign worthy of their regard. "Your Majesty," Ambassador Müller began, his German accented English carrying genuine warmth, "the Swiss Confederation is honored by your gracious reception. We come bearing proposals that we believe will benefit both our nations." What followed was a discussion that would have been impossible in the rigid courts of traditional monarchies. Ilara engaged with the delegation not as a distant sovereign dispensing royal favor, but as an intelligent leader genuinely interested in finding mutually beneficial solutions. She asked probing questions about trade routes, discussed the technical aspects of alpine engineering projects, and demonstrated a grasp of economic theory that left the Swiss representatives clearly impressed. Your Majesty's reputation for wisdom and innovation is well deserved, Ambassador Muller observed as the formal session concluded. The Confederation looks forward to a long and prosperous relationship with Valdoria under your enlightened rule. As the delegation departed, Ilara felt the familiar satisfaction that came from successful diplomacy. Each such meeting strengthened Valdoria's position in the complex web of European politics, building the alliances and relationships that would ensure her kingdom's prosperity for generations to come. The afternoon brought a different kind of satisfaction as she made her weekly visit to the Royal Orphanage, an institution she had established to care for children who had lost their families to poverty, disease, or war. Unlike the formal charity visits that characterized most royal philanthropy, these were working sessions where the Queen rolled up her sleeves and engaged directly with both the children and their caregivers. "Your Majesty," called out young Thomas, a boy of perhaps 8 whose parents had died in a mining accident. He ran toward her with the uninhibited joy of a child who had learned to see the Queen not as a distant figure of authority, but as a caring friend who remembered his name and asked about his studies. "Thomas," she replied, kneeling to his level with a smile that transformed her regal features into something warm and maternal. "How are your letters coming along? Have you been practicing the alphabet I taught you?" For the next 2 hours, Ilara moved through the orphanage like a force of nature, checking on individual children, reviewing educational programs, and discussing improvements with the staff. It was work that many nobles would have considered beneath their dignity, but for Ilara it represented the very essence of what monarchy should be: service to those who needed it most. As evening approached and she prepared to return to the palace, the orphanage's director, Sister Catherine, approached with the quarterly reports. "Your Majesty," the nun said with deep respect, "I wanted you to know that we've received inquiries from institutions across Europe asking about our methods. Your model of royal engagement is inspiring changes far beyond Valdoria's borders." It was a reminder of something Ilara had come to understand about her unique position. She was not just ruling a kingdom, but pioneering a new form of monarchy that emphasized service over privilege, merit over birthright, and genuine care for subjects over mere ceremonial duty. That evening, as she and Marcus shared a quiet dinner in their private apartments, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary transformation her life had undergone. The simple meal, prepared by the palace kitchen, but served without the elaborate ceremony that characterized most royal dining, was a perfect metaphor for the kind of monarchy she was creating. Dignified, but not ostentatious. Formal, but not distant. "Do you ever regret it?" Marcus asked suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "The quiet life we might have had if you hadn't accepted the crown." Ilara considered the question seriously, as she did all matters of importance. "Sometimes I wonder what that life might have looked like," she admitted. "But regret? No. I think we were meant for this, Marcus. Not because of destiny or divine right, but because we have the opportunity to prove that leadership based on merit and compassion can work. And we have proven it," he replied, reaching across the table to take her hand. "Valdoria is more prosperous, more just, and more respected than it has ever been. You've created something remarkable here." "We've created something remarkable," she corrected gently. "I could never have done this alone." As they sat together in the comfortable silence of a couple who had found both love and purpose, a messenger arrived with the evening dispatches. Among them was a letter that made Ilara smile with genuine pleasure, correspondence from Lady Agatha, who had become one of her most trusted advisers despite remaining in London. "My dearest Queen," the letter began in Lady Agatha's characteristic style, "your latest reforms have set all of London talking. The idea of a monarch who actually listens to her subjects and implements policies based on evidence rather than tradition has the progressive thinkers quite beside themselves with excitement, while the old guard mutters darkly about the end of civilization as they know it. I consider both reactions to be ringing endorsements of your approach. I thought you might be amused to know that your former tormentor, Princess Isabella, has become something of a cautionary tale in society circles. Her affair with Count Sterling has become public knowledge, and the scandal has effectively ended any influence she might have hoped to wield. Adrian, meanwhile, has retreated almost entirely from public life, spending his days managing his estates with the grim efficiency of a man trying to lose himself in work. But enough of the past. I write primarily to congratulate you on the university's groundbreaking ceremony, which was reported in all the London papers. The idea of an institution dedicated to educating students based on ability rather than birth has captured imaginations across Europe. I predict that within a decade, every progressive nation will be attempting to replicate your model. Continue to bloom where you have planted yourself, my dear. You have become exactly what the world needs, a leader who proves that true nobility comes from one's actions, not one's ancestry. As Ilara folded the letter, she felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. The girl who had once been humiliated for daring to love above her station had become a woman who was reshaping the very concept of what it meant to rule. She had taken the pain of her past and transformed it into the wisdom that now guided a kingdom. Standing at the window of her private study, looking out over the city that slept peacefully under her protection, Queen Ilara Fine of Valdoria reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had learned that true strength came not from avoiding hardship, but from rising above it, that genuine love was found not in those who accepted you despite your flaws, but in those who saw your potential and helped you achieve it, and that the greatest victories were not won over enemies, but over the limitations others tried to impose upon you. In the distance, the cathedral bells chimed midnight, marking the end of another day in the reign of a queen who had proven that sometimes the most unlikely people were exactly the ones the world needed most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve her people and strengthen her kingdom. But tonight, Ilara was content to stand in the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and a destiny fully embraced. The servant girl who had been deemed unworthy of a duke's love had become a queen worthy of a nation's devotion, and in doing so she had proved that the greatest transformations come not from changing one's circumstances, but from refusing to let circumstances define one's worth. And so ends the remarkable tale of Queen Ilara the Fern of Valdoria, a woman who proved that true nobility comes not from the accident of birth, but from the choices we make and the courage we show in the face of adversity. Her story reminds us that sometimes our greatest defeats become the foundation for our most magnificent victories, and that the opinions of those who cannot see our worth say far more about them than they do about us. If this story has moved you, inspired you, or simply entertained you during your day, I would be deeply grateful if you would take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me continue bringing you these tales of triumph, transformation, and the enduring power of the human spirit. I'm also curious to know where in the world you're listening to Queen Ilara's story. Please leave a comment below telling me which country you're from. I love knowing how far these stories travel and how they touch lives across the globe. Whether you're listening from a bustling city or a quiet countryside, from a palace or a humble home, you are part of this community of dreamers and believers in the power of second chances. Until next time, remember, you are never too small to dream big, never too humble to aspire to greatness, and never too broken to rebuild yourself into something magnificent. Like Queen Ilara, your greatest chapter may still be waiting to be written. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.